how many people in here are attorneys? Okay. How many are technologists? Okay, good. A mix of both. All right. So I'm gonna try and get into the weeds a little bit, but today we're basically talking about legal issues with smart contracts. Now, the funny thing is, we use the term smart contract, but I personally feel like it's a little bit of a misnomer. To me, it's much more of a programmable contract, and sometimes, these things, they're not smart, and they may not even be contracts. So who remembers back in law school what a contract is? Okay, so, the basic thing under contract law, right? It's just offer, acceptance, and consideration. Whether or not these things truly are contracts as recognized under the law is questionable, and it depends also on what jurisdiction you're in, right? The state, the country, the jurisdiction. Can we go to the next slide? Smart contracts were basically put forth back in 1994 by a person named Nick Szabo. He's both a technologist and he actually went to law school, if you guys know, and he's still working on smart contracts today. But smart contracts didn't really get popular until the last couple years, really, when blockchain technology came out. And Ethereum really is the platform that really publicized the concept of smart contracts. Now, there's obviously a lot of hype going on around smart contracts, and I'm not going to go over that today because the media around the hype is so overwhelming. Today instead, I think we're going to bring it back down to earth just a little bit and really talk about what are the limitations of smart contracts, right? Because in order to really deploy these or use these effectively, you have to know what they can't do or what their limitations are. So, I often go around saying smart contracts are in fact not very smart. In fact, they can be quite dumb, right? And the reason why they can be quite dumb is because, whereas traditional contracts, while you're putting your intent down on paper, it does still allow for a lot of flexibility. So for you attorneys out there, for those of you technologists even who have, for example, done consulting work before, right? You'll have a contract, it has your rate, it has your start date, it has your scope of work, and it says, hey, pay me every month, and if you don't pay on time for the month, then you have a 5% late fee. Now, under a traditional contract, you can easily waive that, right? Because the entire situation is very flexible. Under a smart contract, if all these terms are programmed into the smart contract, and it says if payment is not received by the first of the month, then add 5% onto it, suddenly we have a much more rigid situation, right? We as the vendor can't necessarily go and waive that late fee. So, if you're comparing a smart contract versus a traditional contract, you're often looking at situations that are going to end up being a lot more rigid, right? You no longer have that human flexibility, the ability to adapt to different situations. Smart contracts are also vulnerable because they're not written in English, they're written in code, right? And code is static. I often hear the phrase, code is law. This is, what a lot of the technologists say, especially in the Ethereum community. They say, decentralize everything and code is law. And when I hear that, I say, no, code is not law. Law is law. Code and English are merely mediums of communication to allow you to express intent. So when you're working with code, what happens, right? You suddenly are prone to coding errors. The smart contract is only as good as the code that the developer put down, right? Suddenly, you're also opening yourself up to security vulnerabilities. So let's say that maybe your developer who was coding your smart contract wasn't particularly good. Well, if you follow best practices, you're going to go and get what we call a security audit, right? A security audit is you hire a company to basically audit your code and make sure that it's correct, make sure that there aren't any hidden loopholes or vulnerabilities. Now, if you're not getting that security audit or your security auditor isn't good, and trust me, I've come across a lot of not great security auditing companies. You're opening yourself up to hacks that might happen in the future. Going back to limitations of smart contracts, suddenly if a smart contract is super rigid, then how are we supposed to amend, modify, terminate it? The term technologists use is upgradability of smart contracts or evolvability of these smart contracts, right? As of today, if you go out and let's say you are writing a smart contract using Solidity code on Ethereum, now today there's not been a lot of work done as to, okay, maybe the two parties or however many parties suddenly need to change something about the smart contract. Well, if the smart contract is live, how are you supposed to change it now, right? Especially if you didn't also code into the smart contract the ability to even terminate the smart contract or amend it, right? So there's obviously a lot of issues. And then the last one, which is what our company focuses on, is dispute resolution, right? So today, let's say you have a smart contract between two parties. You're going to pay me 1 Bitcoin. I'm going to come and, I don't know, paint your house or something, whatever it might be. Now, if we go ahead and verify that I have actually painted your house, technically what's supposed to happen is that smart contract is supposed to self-execute, and I would get the 1 Bitcoin, and we're supposed to be done. But what happens if, I don't know, you find out later that I used toxic paint, or I didn't do a good job painting, or one of these things where traditionally you would have some method or some manner of recourse. You might go to them, ask for a 5% discount, ask for them to do whatever to make things right. With a smart contract, suddenly that might become a lot harder. In terms of where we are with smart contracts today, there are over 1 million live smart contracts today, and this is actually a figure I pulled back in January. So today, that figure is probably much, much higher. When I checked back in July of 2017, it was only 500,000. So smart contract use is growing exponentially, right? Yet at the same time, you also have to look at how much has been lost in smart contracts. Back in 2016, there was something called the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And for those of you who don't know, it was basically a bunch of, crypto enthusiasts, specifically Ethereum enthusiasts, who basically got together and started a decentralized fund that was governed by a pretty complex smart contract. What ended up happening is one of the people who contributed to the DAO basically ended up also executing a hack on it, and he basically made off with $50 or $60 million worth of Ether at the time. In total, the DAO, I think at the time, had about $150 million in Ether. So he basically made off with about a third of it. And what ended up happening through that hack was there was a huge brawl within the Ethereum community, right? The Ethereum community very much says code is law. So half of the community said, well, technically they didn't do anything to violate the terms of the smart contract. So I guess we really need to just let them, what they did was technically not wrong according to how we said we would govern this community. So we should let him keep it. And of course, the other half of the community said, that's not fair. I put my money in this. I am losing money. I am not okay with this. We should go to the police, which is, really funny if you know the crypto community. But I think all that goes to show that, smart contracts do have vulnerabilities. Two, I think we do need some sort of safety net around it. Now, what that safety net looks like today, a lot of people are still working on this problem. But, back in 2016, the big point is 50 million was lost in that one transaction. They had to hard fork the entire blockchain. In 2017, the figures range, but there's an estimated $1 billion, $1 billion US dollars in value lost through smart contract. And we predict that that number is just going to continue to grow. And I am running out of time, so I'm just going to flip through this. I'll tell you very quickly about what we're doing at our company. So our company is called SageWise. Like I said earlier, we're building a safety net for smart contracts via a toolkit. It's a protocol or an infrastructure level project. And this is supposed to address all the issues that we see with smart contracts. So what that is it's a wrapper, it's an SDK. The SDK, for those of you who don't know, is a software development kit. So it's basically a toolkit, right? Right now we're building on Ethereum, and that SDK is basically a contract wrapper around your smart contract. And part of what it does is it puts into place a couple of roadblocks, right? So normally for a smart contract, if X happens, then Y automatically happens supposedly instantaneously. We put in roadblocks so that you can say, okay, well, Y is going to happen, but it's going to happen with a 24 or 48 or 72 hour delay. You choose the time. We pair that with what we call our Contract Canary. Contract Canary is basically a monitoring and notification service so that you know what is actually happening with your smart contract. So what is supposed to happen is you have a live smart contract. You have programmed it to say, okay, every time someone is withdrawing funds from a smart contract, we want a 24-hour delay. Then, with the notification service, you get email and text notifications at, hey, someone's about to withdraw $1 million from the smart contract. If that is not what you think is supposed to happen, then you have an opportunity. You have a 24 or 48 or however many hour window to go ahead and freeze execution of that smart contract. Now, if you let that window go by and it executes and it's on especially a public blockchain, which is supposed to be immutable, then sorry, you're a little bit out of luck, right? But if you stop it before it happens, or if you take a moment to pause to evaluate, is this what we expect should be happening or not, then you have the opportunity to actually fix it. And when you have the opportunity, it allows you to amend, modify, terminate. Maybe there's a dispute that you are going to resolve with the other party offline, right? And to the extent that there is a dispute that the two of you or however many of you in the contract cannot resolve, then we have what you call a dispute resolution marketplace. And the reason why it's a marketplace is because we studied a lot of different types of disputes, and disputes are not a one-size-fits-all thing, right? How you resolve a $5 bar bet is very different from how you go and resolve a $5 million, enterprise dispute where the company has a general counsel and they're never going to use anything other than a traditional mediator or arbitrator. Now, we are blockchain agnostic and we are dispute resolution process agnostic. So what that means is we're merely giving you the infrastructure or the tools to go ahead and monitor, get notifications, freeze, modify, get dispute resolution, and do collections and enforcement for your smart contract. We don't actually care how you resolve your dispute. If you want to use a crowd jury, for example, that's the popular thing right now, right? A lot of the crypto technologists are saying, hey, we think we can solve justice with algorithms and game theory, and we're going to Uberize jurors. So we'll see how that works. I think it's probably limited to a smaller scope of disputes in general. But if you want to use a crowd jury, that's fine. If you want to flip a coin and see heads or tails, that's fine. If you want an automated bot to resolve a small financial microtransaction, and that already happens today, by the way. PayPal, eBay has a bot that resolves over 60 million small financial microtransaction disputes each year, only 5% of which are ever touched by a human being, right? So that's already happening, then fine. And if you want to go use a traditional mediator or arbitrator because the stakes are higher, because the parties are much more sophisticated, because this is a much bigger deal, then fine, right? So we don't actually care how you resolve your dispute. We merely provide you the marketplace and a lot of vendors that you can choose from in order to resolve your dispute. And of course, if you guys have ever been involved in a lawsuit, you guys know that collections and enforcement is, the bane of your existence when you're in litigation or you go file a lawsuit of any type, because the first couple years you spend filing the lawsuit, then the next couple years you have to go file another lawsuit to even collect and deal with judgments and liens, and by that time the party that you're trying to collect against has probably declared bankruptcy. Smart contracts, we think, provide incredible avenue, kind of a silver bullet for the whole collections enforcement issue, especially since you can use them essentially as a digital escrow. There's a couple of markets that we think are especially prime for smart contracts to take off in, and those are financial services, supply chain and international trade, insurance, digitized assets. We've also been looking at consumer marketplaces. We're not quite sure how well smart contracts will work there yet, just because a lot of these new decentralized marketplaces, I'm not sure how the decentralization thing is going to work, just because essentially that would mean they would not be providing customer service, and we'll see. But the legacy legal infrastructure is we found to be a $10 trillion market size, right? And today, I think if even not in the United States, even if you go around the world, I think what you'll see is that a lot of people are very unhappy with the incumbent legal systems today, right? They're slow, they're inefficient, they're costly. Sometimes they are corrupted by local governments or politics or things of that sort. And so we think blockchain and smart contracts have incredible potential to change some of what's been happening in the legal industry up to date. And that is my last slide, and I am low on time, but I think I have about 6 minutes for questions.
Yes, any questions? Hands, I see up here.
Hi. A lot of people, a lot of developers have their own frustrations with the Ethereum platform as a whole, its workability. And we've been looking for other players to come into the space. EOS is really right on the cusp of launching. I was wondering if you had any opinions on EOS compared to the comments you just made about smart contracts as they exist in Solidity, and specifically regarding delegated proof of stake in terms of the governance model that they're presenting and how that might apply to dispute resolution.
Okay, so EOS is an interesting blockchain just because they have architected into their blockchain the ability to even have arbitration, which Ethereum does not contemplate at all, right? Now, we're still waiting to see more details about what that architecture for arbitration looks like and how it'll actually be used. I think, though, another consideration you want to take into account when you are developing is not just the whole dispute resolution arbitration system, which of course is important, but I think the bigger thing that developers are currently looking at is, when they build on Ethereum, it takes so much gas, it's so expensive to run, whereas EOS, it's supposed to be a lot faster, a lot cheaper. That's going to be a huge consideration as well. Now, there's a lot of startups out there who are coming up with new smart contract languages. It's just that we're so early in the game today, it's really hard to recommend anyone. But I will say that I spent probably most of first quarter talking to a ton of smart contract security auditing firms, right? And by and large, what I heard from them were a lot of frustrations in terms of, in order to really code a smart contract well, they said, you really need to have a much better architected smart contract language, and currently a lot of people feel that Solidity is not that. They feel, it changes too often. You really have to be dedicated to coding on it 24/7 in order to really code things in a smart but also a secure way. And so I think a lot of people are still waiting for, we're in the early days, right? We're like in the, Netscape Navigator days, and we're still waiting to see the Google Chromes and the Mozilla Firefoxes that are going to come up.
Okay, great. And we will try to get in just a few more questions if that's okay. We're not too bad on time.
Hi there. What are your thoughts on the possibility or practicality of a court-ordered hard fork in order to resolve a smart contract dispute?
That's interesting. So here's the thing, and first of all, I think it depends on whether you are talking about a public blockchain or a private blockchain, right? Because private, there's probably not going to be as many nodes. It's probably going to be maybe owned by or controlled by a private company, like several departments within that company or a consortium of companies. So it might be a little bit easier to manage. But as far as a court-ordered fork for a public blockchain, I think it's going to be very difficult. So one of the things you have to remember about, for example, the Ethereum community, that's the most popular one, right? Is there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of nodes out there, and the entire network is supposed to be decentralized, right? And so, if you have a court coming out and saying, okay, you have to hard fork, well, who do they go to, right? Because in this case, it's not a centralized organization, really. I mean, I know there's Ethereum Foundation, but it's not really a centralized organization. No one really has that authority. You could propose it within the community, but the community would have to agree. And then there's a lot of other issues in terms of, okay, jurisdiction, right? Let's say, I don't know, a California court says it. Well, you're hard forking the blockchain of, an entire world, right? And then secondly, if you are changing, if you're hard forking just because of the result of one smart contract, you have to remember there are millions of smart contracts on the blockchain, and you're going to hard fork it for one smart contract. Now they did that back in 2016 for the DAO, but it's because Ethereum was so young. But like you saw from the Parity wallet hacks last year, they lost, I can't even remember what the final figure was. I think it was 120 million is basically sitting there untouchable because of, a mistake that a developer made in deleting some code within Parity wallet. And right now there's a raging debate actually around, how can we basically reverse this transaction? And much of the community is saying, you lost it, too bad. But when you do hard fork the blockchain, you have to remember that you are picking winners and losers. And so the question is that really fair, right? There was a quote in one of my slides. It happened shortly after the DAO. Someone on Reddit said, hey, I lost 10K a couple weeks ago because I wrote a bad smart contract. Can we hard fork it for that? Because I want to get my money back. It's not fair that these people got their money back, but I'm not able to get mine. So there's a lot of issues with hard forking, especially on a public blockchain.
Okay, we can do one more in the back. Okay. Anyone else before I make my trek to this side? Okay.
So a month ago, we heard about ERC20 bug batch overflow. So I was thinking, even if you write a smart contract perfectly, if the protocol itself has a bug or a critical error, like, how are we going to move forward from this problem? How can we make sure these protocols are trustworthy? How can the SEC or like private companies, the community itself, can make sure that the baseline, the infrastructure is safe?
So the batch overflow bug was actually not a problem with the Ethereum blockchain or the protocol. It was actually, there were a certain number of ERC20 tokens where I think basically what they did was, in this community, everyone copies each other, right? Like everything's open source, you pull code, you recycle it, maybe you modify a bit. And so like I have to go back and look at what we said about that one. But I believe that that one was not a problem with the actual blockchain. It was the problem with, you know, the specific ERC20 code for those particular tokens. It was not a problem with the actual protocol.
Okay, and we have one final question, then we'll get into our panel.
Yeah, so as a developer, if I create ICO contracts for, I guess, companies, am I responsible for any of their legal actions if they misuse the contracts?
Oh man, okay. That's an interesting question. I'll give you my opinion, which you cannot rely on, and then I'll tell you the opinion of someone who's going to be speaking, I think at the end of today, David Silver, right? So my opinion is, you know, first of all, if you are a developer, I think there's a certain set of best practices, right? Let's say you code a smart contract for someone. Obviously, you want to try to do your best. You also want to recommend that they go and do a security audit, right? I would see if there's a way of buying yourself some insurance. I would also make sure that the service contract that you sign with that company has indemnification clauses, right? I would use our safety net, right, our SDK. In terms of whether or not you're liable, I think that is kind of an unexplored question, and I think it's going to change jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think some jurisdictions, you know, if you look at it, they might look at intent. Other ones might treat it as negligence, whether or not it was foreseeable, what the industry standard is. So it's hard to give you a real answer. I personally don't think that, you know, the developer should necessarily be liable, but you have to remember that we're kind of in a brave new world right now where, you know, previously, let's say you worked with a startup and you did some faulty code, right? Well, it was a centralized organization, and that startup, maybe the startup would go under, maybe they had insurance, maybe they would fix it somehow. In this brave new world where projects are decentralized and teams are distributed, and you don't necessarily even have employees, you just have like enthusiasts who work on a project, there's actually no protection, which in many ways for the developer is actually much, much worse. Now, I've actually talked to Dave Silvers about this. He's the class action attorney that's going around and suing all the ICOs. He's speaking at the end of today. And, you know, while we differ on opinions on whether or not the developer should be liable, I think a month or two ago, he actually did file a lawsuit against a dev shop. But I think it was in context of an ICO that had raised money that was an unregistered security. So I don't think it was actually because of some sort of coding error vulnerability. It was just because he's going after big pockets. So maybe you want to ask that question of him.
Okay, and we do have one final one up front before we wrap.
I actually just wanted to follow up on his question. As an attorney, at what point in the future, say there is a language, a coding language that's being developed for smart contracts specifically, at what point may attorneys have to learn that and then become liable? Because, I mean, you could be advising these clients on multi-million-dollar deals and they want to use a smart contract, so you're just going to be advising a developer. I mean, someone has to be liable for that fault if it comes to that.
So there's a number of different approaches that people are taking to it. So what I see most often, honestly, is developers are writing their smart contract in a silo. They're not really talking to anyone else on their team, right? And so what you see is like a smart contract that comes out and you're like, wow, this doesn't reflect anything that they said in the white paper for the ICO. That should not happen. I think the better approach is you have a developer who's writing a smart contract to the extent that it's an ICO or, you know, there are actually legal issues involved. They should be working with the attorney, and the attorney, to the extent they can't read code, should be asking, okay, so let's go line by line, help me interpret what everything means, right? Because you have to remember, at the end of the day, these are if-then clauses. Now, I know a lot of attorneys can't read code, Now, some law firms are going out and hiring attorneys who have previously had some sort of coding background, and so they can be like that intermediary in between. I would say from a much larger perspective, even outside of the blockchain community, there's a lot happening within legal tech, and there are now law schools that are starting to train lawyers not to necessarily become, programmers, but to know just enough of programming to be able to understand and read it to at least a certain level or extent. The liability issues, I don't know yet. We haven't even begun to explore that. But, I think depending on how much blockchain and smart contracts and even legal tech take off in the next couple years, maybe the legal profession, I hope, is going to look a lot different than what it looks like today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. We're going to take about a 7 to 10 minute break. It'll give everyone a chance to stretch, take a break if they need it. Thank you so much, Amy.